I will begin this talk by sharing two memories. One that involves the telling of a story, and the other that involves the absence of one. Let's travel back in time a little bit to Nairobi in the 1980s. I'm 5 years old, and my little sister is about 3 or 4 years old. We're seated in the living room couch, Saturday afternoon, involved in the rigors of play. Meanwhile, my dad is doing that thing that African dads are contractually obligated to do on Saturday afternoons. He's seated on his designated seat, reading his newspaper. So he decides to take a break, comes over to check on us to see what we're up to. I'm coloring, I say, and I'm writing, says my sister. Okay. And he checks what we're up to, and he looks at her activity book. And this was a little fun activity book that had all these little exercises, and the page that had preoccupied her attention on this afternoon was one on which a blank postcard had been printed, with lines where the child was supposed to fill in words. Except, of course, she can't write, so what she had there was squiggles. So Dad picks up the book and inspects the squiggles that were all resting so neatly on the line, making such a realistic depiction of actual handwriting, complete with spaces in between the words. And he asks, "Who is this letter to?" And because she's 3 or 4 years old, her social circle hasn't grown that big, so she casts her glance on me and says, "It's to him." And he asks, "Could I read this letter?" And her face lights up and she says, "Yes." And so Dad goes to work, improvising words out of these squiggles and scribbles. Words that become sentences, sentences that become a story. A little girl's letter to her big brother. And this story was amazing. It had all these things that she was up to, all these places she'd been to, all these plans that she had in store, all delivered in grown-up speak, which of course we were incapable of speaking at the time, with phrases such as, "How have you been?" "I have been well. It's been a while. I hope you're okay." Now, of course, I'm a 5-year-old man watching this happen, so of course I was in on this little game after all. And you'd think I was sitting there looking all cozy with a knowing smile on my face, but no. This magic was working on me as well. I was just as awed as my sister was listening to these words, because I had no idea that she was so eloquent. I had no idea that our lives were so much fun. As Dad read this postcard, we were educated, we were fun, we were well-traveled, we were exotic, we were borderline grown up. So Dad completes his little mission in raising his 2 little kids on this Saturday afternoon, goes back to his newspaper, and leaves us on the floor, my sister and I, just staring at each other. Awed, content, as if we were saying to each other, "Hey, I had no idea until now, but you're pretty all right." That's story number 1. If you want to know how we looked, that's us. That's about the time of the telling of this story. Now, 5 years later, and here's story number 2. I'm in school, primary school. It's after hours, and my friend Martin and I are wandering around the school compound waiting to get picked up. This happened a lot. And we'd spend this time whiling away time by just having conversations as 2 little boys would about all sorts of subjects, whether it was movies and TV shows that we'd seen, or whether it was our forming opinions on matters like sports and religion and girls. Now, on this particular evening, in this Catholic school compound, we wander into a place that we don't usually go to that often, a more deserted part of the school compound. And there we find another pupil. For the purposes of this story, I will call him Brutus. You'll understand why. Now, Brutus was about 3 years ahead of us. That meant he was bigger, he was taller. Except he was a quiet boy. And he had these wild, vacant eyes, didn't speak very much. And he had this permanent scowl on his face, the kind you'd find on someone that doesn't get to speak that often. We would discover in a few minutes that we had encroached into his turf. Now, ordinarily, we'd seen Brutus before, but ordinarily he'd get lost in the crowd of his louder, more congenial classmates. But on this particular evening, there he was, alone, roaming the grounds. This part of the school compound, which we would soon discover, was his turf. So before we can venture any further, Brutus approaches us and stands before us, hulking over us, staring us down with those vacant eyes. And he asks, "What are your names?" Martin gives his name, but I hesitate. See, in previous engagements with kids bigger than myself, and there were many, when they asked, "What's your name?" I immediately knew that they were up to something naughty, unruly. And "what's your name?" was simply the question they asked to get the conversation started. Now, my name, Mugambi, was the perfect conversation starter, because it was almost inevitably followed up by the question, "What is your Christian name?" And when I had no answer to that question, then, almost like clockwork, an unkind or spiteful remark would follow, because everybody needs to have a Christian name. So I stay silent. And Brutus is obviously displeased by my silence, because he asks one more time, "What's your name?" Except this time he punctuates the question with a swift kick to my groin. Now, I did not see that coming. And it hurt like hell. And so I crumbled to the ground, and I remained silent, not saying my name, not just in defiance of Brutus, but in defiance of the pain that was coursing through my body, and in defiance of the tears that were threatening to come out of my eyes. Martin reads the situation and picks me up, and we leave Brutus's turf. And as we limp back to civilization, we decide that the course of action that would work best for us would be to snitch. And so Martin strides up to the teacher on duty and launches into this story, describing the location of the crime and the perpetrator. And then he gestures in my direction, leaving the best part of the story to me, the description of the crime. And I can't speak. I'm in pain. I'm humiliated. It's taking everything in me to not just grab onto that part of my body that feels so much pain right now. But that is not socially acceptable. And so it takes everything in me to just string 3 sentences together, 3 words together. He kicked me. Seeing no evidence of injury on my body, the teacher asks, "Where did he kick you?" And this time it's not defiance keeping me quiet. I simply can't find my voice. See, how do you describe getting beat up on this part of your body that you don't ordinarily involve in conversation with a grown-up? And if she decided to escalate the matter, how many more times would I have to tell this embarrassing story? "Teacher, he kicked him here," Martin says, not pointing at my body but on his own. And I look at him and I wonder what courage, what presence of mind, what generosity you have to do this for me. And before this case can continue any further, Dad's jalopy comes. I grab my bag, I run. I slide quietly into the car, followed by my sister, who you might remember from a few minutes ago. And we go off, and I say nothing of this event ever again, until now. That's the power of stories right there. I took you guys on a little journey. That empathetic light in you shone on this story, on the characters, and you're probably able to identify with each and every one of them. Yes, even Brutus. I'd like to believe we're a little closer now, a little bit more connected, so that at the end of this all, we can say to each other, "Hey, I had no idea until now, but you're pretty all right." Stories give meaning to our lives. They are a manual on how we need to live. They are the most prolific art form in existence, and it's been said storytelling is the activity in which we spend the most time indulging in. They are a life force, the very essence of the connection between humans. They are the backbone of cultures, of beliefs, of entire civilizations. They've raised children, they've started revolutions, they've ended wars. They've connected and disconnected friends, families, lovers, and strangers. They're building us up and they're breaking us down. And as limitless as as limited in supply that stories are, and as accessible as they are to us all, stories are a precious resource. Now think about it. Like every single precious resource that exists out there, forces have risen and exist to control them. They have created systems that dictate whose voices need to be heard and whose shouldn't. They've erased stories going back generations and replaced them with their own. They've stifled voices in the name of God, or in the name of country, or of morality, or national security, or whatever situation they'll come up with next. And in this evil system of control and censorship, other stories have been told that have made the innocent guilty, that have alienated minorities, that have made the oppressor the oppressed, and have promoted prejudice and inequality. I'd like to say this, that the world's systemic injustices continue to occur not because of the telling of false stories, but worse, because of the silencing of the truthful ones. Ladies and gentlemen, there has never been a time when it's more urgent, more necessary for our collective consciousness to be fashioned around truthful stories that nurture, that restore, that heal, and that rebuild this planet and its precious inhabitants. At the beginning of this, I shared two memories with you. Two memories that showed me early on in life the two realities that stories can exist in, the fullness of them when they are abundant and truthful and wholesome, and the absence of them when they are stifled. These two events led me to where I am now, where my titles might read actor, writer, director, teacher, improv comedian, but which I love to instead summarize as storyteller. And how did I get to this point? There's another story there. In the middle of that story, I'm putting on a pair of pajama trousers, going to sleep, sleeping on a couch and crying myself to sleep in Philadelphia in the winter of 2009. How did I get to that point? Well, months before that, I bought that pair of pajamas along with a dress shirt, a tie, a blazer. Syracuse, New York, upstate New York, where I was attending grad school. We were about to have our graduation formal, which was when all the students came together to celebrate the end of our master's studies. And boy, were we optimistic. The world was our oyster. Just a year before, we had been told that America was just ready to snatch us up into employment. I was making applications to ad agencies at the time because I was studying a master's in advertising. And I knew that it was only a matter of time before I was your quintessential New Yorker. I was going to have an office or a cubicle on Madison Avenue, and I'd make the commute there via subway from my apartment, probably in Brooklyn, with my coffee cup in hand, not Starbucks because that would be too mainstream for me. And I'd attend art galleries, and I'd go to all these fine restaurants, and I'd go to Broadway plays and independent cinemas, and I'd be an influencer on social media on 2 continents. But instead, what happened months later was that I was wearing a pair of pajamas and going to sleep, jobless and broke, on a friend's couch. We were months into the recession, and ad agencies were hemorrhaging, not just money and clients, but also employees. So my dream had pretty much died. However, those pajama bottoms were very comfortable. Very comfortable. And I had a meal in my belly, and I had the resolve to wake up and fight another day. So what happened after that? Many weeks later, I decided, after resolving that I was going to be an actor again and I was going to make the most of my acting life, I ended up in a small community theater play in the esteemed role of soldier number 2. I'm the guy who's pointing, just in case you don't know. Later on, many other stories came up. For instance, my mom telling me over the phone as we're having a conversation and saying, hey, listen, I know you're out there and it's hard, but I need to tell you something, son. I don't worry about you that often. Or it was much later when I ended up in this film that you're told about, Nairobi Half Life. And I'll never forget when I was being cast and I was told the audition was successful, and this gentleman on the other end of the line said, hey, this film is going to be special. Or it was me and Mbithi, my friend, sitting and going through all these thoughts about loss and death and the transience of life, and fashioning those thoughts into a film about people who live in an afterlife where they can't go into everlasting until they sort out the issues that they couldn't sort out when they were alive. Or I could tell you about the story where we learned that kids who are suffering terminal illnesses have a firmer hand on loss than their parents do, so that we ended up writing a film not about loss and tragedy, but about the triumph of the human spirit and heroism that lives in all of us. Or I could tell you about how I was making my own film, Lusala, and I passed the time where I was simply terrified every day, in between takes, having conversations with the cast and crew, conversations that ended up showing up in the final film itself. I hope you get to see it in June. Or I could tell you about all the storytellers that exist, this community that I'm so proud to be a part of, that tells stories about our dark history where our broadcast media couldn't. Or tell tender, heartfelt stories about those people in our society that wouldn't have their stories told any other way. Or those defiant storytellers defying censorship to tell stories about the various ways that Kenyans can express love and culture and identity. Or I could tell you about those people telling Kenya's history, past, present, future, on stages with such pizzazz and such charm. Or I could tell you about those people who took broadcasting into their own hands and tell Kenya's news stories with such depth and such passion. Or I could tell you about those people that make us laugh and repackage the Kenyan experience of living in ways that we can laugh at ourselves, because it's necessary to do that every so often. However, I want us to tell a story about us. These people in the room, this vast network of stories waiting to be told. At the end of this, I want to conclude this. I don't wish you just stories, because stories are going to happen to you regardless. What I wish you instead is your voice. As different as that voice may sound, as feeble as it may be, as unsure as you may be, may your voices be heard. May they enable you to stand firmly, to breathe deeply, to be more present to the awesomeness of this moment and every moment that comes after it. And when you find your voice, I pray that you will tell stories responsibly, stories that build, not destroy, stories that affirm and not harm, stories that shine a light on the empathy that we possess, the depth we possess, because no matter what anyone tells you, it's always there, it always exists, it always will. May you always remember that what you have to say matters. It affects multitudes, whether you're speaking truth to power, whether you're getting your voice out in public physical spaces, or on your individual virtual online spaces. Even if that voice that needs to be heard by you, wherever, however that story needs to be told, I wish you your voice. I wish you your story. And in the fullness of this moment, allow me to say this thing that I could not say all those years back. Just a few minutes ago, Brutus kicked me here. And I didn't know until now, but it wasn't so bad after all. Thank you.